Welcome to the fifth tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through the process of generating a report containing important details on each of the groups of users maintained on your Tableau server. I'll show you how to query your Tableau server for information on each group and its corresponding members using Tableau Server Client, and subsequently write that information to an Excel workbook. Before jumping into the coding aspect of this video, allow me to speak to this type of report's use cases. A groups report allows you to understand what your Tableau server looks like in terms of groups. It allows you to answer questions like, how many total groups does our Tableau server currently support? How many users are members of each group, and who are those users? Additionally, a groups report allows you to understand the role groups play on your Tableau server. Are groups used for the purposes of your server's permissions model? Given a particular group, which projects and corresponding content do that group's members have access to? It is critical to understand how groups fit into your permissions model so that you can be confident in how access to content published on your Tableau server is being managed. Having briefly discussed the use cases, I will now jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin writing a script to generate a report on the groups maintained on my Tableau server. For this example, I'm going to send a request to my Tableau server to provide a list of all groups existing on the server. After retrieving that list of group objects, I will create a simple report that provides important details on each group. Additionally, I will walk through how to incorporate what you learned in my previous video on generating a users report to include the members of each group and their corresponding details. At the end of this walkthrough, I will show you how to write the report to an Excel file for reporting and dissemination purposes. The first step I need to take is to configure my connection to the Tableau server. If you are unfamiliar with how to configure a connection to your Tableau server for authentication purposes, please watch video 2 of this series. In that video, I walk through connecting to Tableau server for the first time. I will also place the link to the video in the comments section. After configuring the connection details, I can begin working towards a solution that will generate the desired groups report. I need to use the Tableau Server Client object I configured in the first code block to sign in. I've went ahead and started off the second code block by doing just that. I'm using a context manager to ensure I stay signed in while attempting to access information on my Tableau server. Additionally, this ensures that I also sign out each time. To begin, we're going to run the first block to create our Tableau Server Client object, which is going to allow us to configure this connection and eventually sign in. So I've run that, it runs successfully. The next step is we're going to access the groups endpoint. So how do I know there is a groups endpoint that's going to allow me to gather all of the groups, or a list of the groups that are on my Tableau server? Well, I know that because if I access server and then I go server._dict, I can see all of the possible endpoints that I can access using the Tableau Server Client. So we have the groups one here. There's also the users one that we used previously. There's a lot of endpoints we'll use in future videos too. So let's go ahead and do that. What we can do to gather a list of those groups that are on my server, I can use list comprehension. I'm going to say groups is equal to group for group in tsc.pager server.groups, so the endpoint. So if I run this is going to authenticate/sign in with my server, gather that list of groups from my server, and capture those within a list. All right, so I've successfully executed that piece of code. Let's take a look at what the contents of the groups list is. All right, so we have two groups. These group items are the actual group objects. So I have one group item and the UID, so the unique identifier of this group item is this. The second unique identifier is this. And this tells me that there's one group called all users, which is the default group on your Tableau server. And then there is one custom group that I've created myself called North America Sales Team. Okay, so these are objects and they have attributes, right? So you can see a few of them here. But if we want to see perhaps all of the attributes we can access per group, what we can do is I'm going to access the first object in this list of group objects. And then let's just do the same thing we did with server earlier. Let's say _dict. So we have the ID, we have the license mode, the minimum site role, so to be a member of that group, the users, which are none, the name of the group, and the domain name. Now, the one thing about the users is it shows none, but in order to see each group's users, we actually have to run a separate method. We'll get into that here in a moment, but there's a separate method that allows you to populate the users for each group. It doesn't come naturally or just by default by accessing each group object. Okay, so we have our groups. We have a list of group objects, and that looks like this. So there's 2 groups on my server. What do we need to do next? Well, for this groups report, we're going to want to create a data frame that contains each group's information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say create a data frame containing group information. And how am I going to go about doing this? I'm going to say group info. So I'm going to create a data frame called group info. And let's use pandas to create a data frame. And I'm going to extract each of the key pieces of information I would like for my data frame. So I'm going to get the group ID, that's a given. And to do this, for each group that is in my list of group objects, I'm going to again use a list comprehension to extract each of those group IDs. So I'm going to say group.id for group in groups. I'm going to do a very similar thing for the rest of the attributes. So I want the group name. And what I can do is I'm just going to copy and paste this, because the only thing that's going to change from list comprehension to list comprehension is going to be the attribute which I'm extracting. In this case, I want the name. And in the next case, what else do I want? So let's get the group domain. So in my case here, on my Tableau Cloud server, this server I use for tutorials, I only have 2 groups, and they're both domain is local. You may have, within your organization, several domains that actually may allow you to differentiate where the user and where the group is tied to, right? The region. But here in this case, we don't have that. I'm going to go ahead and add the domain anyways. And let's say, so I need to close this off. And let's copy and paste this again. And I'm going to say group, instead of .id, I'm going to say domain name. And then finally, let's go ahead and do this for now so we can see what this looks like. So I'm going to run this. It's going to re-authenticate. It's going to generate that list of groups objects. And then it's going to create this data frame called group info that contains the group ID, name, and domain for each group on my Tableau server. So let's look at what the group info looks like. All right, so as expected, we have 2 rows of data, 1 row per group that exists on my server. We have the all users group, and then the North America sales team group, and the corresponding group ID. So these group IDs are very important for this tutorial's later purposes. So we're eventually going to use these group IDs to tie them back to users so that we can see, okay, for each group on our server, which users are members of that group. You'll more often than not need the IDs associated with each object type so that you can tie that object type to other objects. So for example, if you have users and you have their LUID, so their locally unique identifier, or ID in this case, if you have that, you can tie the user to other objects or content on your server. Like, okay, for this user, what data sources do they own? What workbooks do they own? What flows do they own, and so forth. So super critical piece of information that you'll most likely need for all of your analyses. Okay, so we have the group info data frame. We know what it looks like. Let's go ahead and go through the step of populating the users for each group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, first I'm going to document this. I'm going to say, let's go ahead and populate the user info for each user within each group. And to do this, we're going to use a method called populate users. So I'm going to say for group in groups, server.groups.populate users, and I'm going to pass in the group. So what we're doing here is we're going to iterate through this list of group objects. There's 2 of them. And then for each of those group objects, we're going to call the populate users method and pass in the group object. So this is going to populate the users that are members of each of those corresponding groups. Let's go ahead and make use of the population of users within each group by adding the users to our data frame. So we can say users, and we're going to use a list comprehension again, but what we're going to do is we're going to create a list of lists. So each sublist is going to be the list of users corresponding to a particular group. Let's say user.id for user in group.users. And then I'm going to say for group in groups. So again, what we're going to have is we're going to have one list per group within a list. And each of those sublists are going to contain the users corresponding to each group. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay, now let's look at our data frame again. You'll notice here, so we have the expected group ID, group name, group domain, and then we have users. So what does our list of users look like? It's going to contain, again, a list of the users for that particular group captured within one row. Now, for reporting purposes, we don't typically want this, right? We don't want to have multiple pieces of information captured within a single intersection, so a cell, if you will. What we want to do is we want to break this out. So if we have two users in a group, we want to replicate the information corresponding to the group, but have one row per user within that group. So we want to update this data frame to have a granularity of one row per user, per group that user belongs to. And how can we do that? What we can do is we can use Pandas' explode method to make that happen. So I'm going to say, let's transform data frame to display, let's say to display one row per group per user. And to do this again, we'll just say group info. I'm going to reference the same data frame. I'm going to say group info dot explode, and I'm going to say column. Which column do I want to actually explode, right? Which one do I want to unpack all of the values that are in that list of users and represent those across multiple rows? So one row per user within that list. I'm going to say column is equal to users. And let's go ahead and run this. And then let's look at group info again. And look at that. So we have two users in each of these groups. So in all users, we have each user that's on the server. And the North America sales team actually has the same exact two users. So two users belong to this group. And the granularity is as we would like, right? We don't want to have multiple users captured within a single row. We want to capture those across multiple rows, so one row per user. This is much more report friendly. All right, as a next step, let's incorporate what we learned in the previous video on generating a user's report by copying and pasting the user info data frame here. I'll do that now. And let me just briefly explain. So for those that have not watched the previous video, we're using the user's endpoint, much like we use the group's endpoints in this video, to extract various attributes corresponding to each user and creating a data frame that is basically saying, hey, here are all of my users on my site and their corresponding details. And the reason I've pasted this in here, you may be asking, why did he paste this at this particular position as opposed to pasting it after the explosion or the transformation of the group info data frame? The reason is, if I need to access or communicate with an endpoint on my server and subsequently create a data frame that also requires access to server resources or endpoints, well, I need to ensure that I'm connected to the server still. If I put it below here, I will have already signed out. And it's going to give me you're not signed in error, basically. So let's go ahead and run this and look at what we have. So we're going to take a look at the user info data frame. Again, it's going to look and feel just like the group info data frame, just different attributes or details. So let's run this. Okay, and then let's go to user info. Take a look at that. And in this user info, the granularity of this data frame is one row per user. So I have the locally unique identifier that we're going to be able to use to tie each of these users to the corresponding groups they are members of. In this case, these are just two users that are tied directly to me, just different email addresses for demonstrative purposes. So we have the username, display name, email address, the domain, and the site role. Okay, so we have our user info data frame and we have our group info data frame. The next step is, how do we bring these two things together? What we're going to do is we're going to merge these two data frames. So I'm going to just say join group info and user info data frames. And the way I'm going to go about doing this is I'm going to say groups report equals. So this is going to be our report, right? So our reports, as I previously mentioned at the beginning of this video, is the idea is we want to create a report that contains one row per user per group they are a member or part of. All right, so let's go ahead and say groups report equals. And then we'll say group info. So take the group info data frame we're going to merge it with, what are we going to merge it with? We're going to say merge it with the user info data frame. And how are we going to merge these two data frames? We're going to say left. And I'll explain why we're going to do left here in a moment. So I'm going to say left on. So what is the shared attribute or column or data point that these two data frames have in common? I'm going to say users. And then right on, I'm going to say user ID. And then that should do that. And what I'll do right now, let me just briefly explain what's going on here in case you're not familiar with the merge method. This is going to take the two data frames, so our group data frame and our user data frame, and merge them much like an SQL join. So in this case, it's going to be a left join. Or if you're more familiar with Excel, it's like a VLOOKUP, but across multiple columns. So I'm going to go ahead and merge these two data frames based on their shared column, so users. And what that looks like is, okay, I have a group ID, and I have the user ID, right? So if I go here, let's just say group info real quick. I'm going to merge on where the group ID value, or sorry, the user ID value within the group's data frame matches the user ID value in the user info data frame. And that's basically going to ensure that the information captured in each row corresponds to the right user within the right group. Okay, and why are we doing left? Well, we're doing left because there could be situations where I've created groups, or you've created groups, your organization has created groups on your server that are placeholders for now. There are no users populated or members of that group yet, but in your report, you still want to represent that group within the report, right? We don't want to exclude it just because there are no members. That's why I'm using left. Now, if you did want to exclude it, because if there are no members, you could change this how parameter. You could say enter. That's up to you. I prefer to represent all groups regardless of the number of members corresponding to that group. All right, so I've used left. We're going to merge it on the user's value equaling the user ID value in the user info data frame. The next thing I'm going to do is drop the repetitive column that results from the merging of these two data frames. So our instructions on merging these two data frames are using the users column within the group's info data frame and the user ID column within the user info data frame. I don't need both of those, so I'm going to drop one of them. So let's say .drop columns. And which column am I going to drop? I'm going to drop the user ID one. Okay, so if we run this, we're going to see, hey, we've created the groups report. Let's take a look at that report. Okay, so as expected, we have, in this report, we have one row per group, per user that's a member of that group. So just to recap, we had two users on my server and we had two groups. And in this case, both of those users are members of both groups. So the default all users groups, and then the North America sales team group. So we have 4 rows. Again, both users are members of each group, and that's why we have 4 rows. This is exactly how we want our report, right? 1 row per user per group that user is a member of. Okay, so our report looks fantastic. Now, the only thing about this is we don't want this to just stay in my editor, right? We don't want this to stay in Visual Studio Code or whatever IDE you're using. We actually need to write this somewhere, output this information to some type of medium. In this case, we're going to write it to an Excel workbook, and that's going to allow you to disseminate it, for reporting purposes. So let's do that now. All right, so to do this, I'm going to use pathlib to create a path object, and then I'm going to use pandas Excel writer to write this file, or this, in this case, this data frame, to a file, an Excel file, at a specified file path. So let's do that now. So I'm going to say write path is equal, and I'm going to say pathlib.path. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy and let me just put an F string here quickly. I'm going to copy and paste the path from my file system here. So let me just copy and paste this path. Okay, got the path. So here's the path. And then what do I want to name this file? I'm going to call it a groups report. And I'm going to say underscore. And then the next thing I want to do is I also want to append the time for which this report was generated. It's highly likely that you're going to generate multiple groups reports over time. One, you don't want to overwrite it, right? But also, you want to be able to differentiate between one group's report from another. So an easy way to do that is to append the time in which this code block or this report was generated. So what we can do to do that, what I'm going to do is I am going to use datetime, so my datetime module, and I'm going to say datetime.now. So what is the current time when running this code block? So I'm going to say datetime now. What's the time zone? I'm going to say time zone. And for this case, I'm just going to say UTC. Let's just use UTC. And then I'm going to say, let's format the time. And how do I want to format this? What I'm going to do, instead of hand typing this out, I use the same exact format model when I write every single file of mine. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. And what is this format model? This format model is the year, month, day, hours, minutes, seconds. So 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day, hours, minutes, and seconds. So it's highly unlikely that you're going to need any more precision than this, so all the way down to the seconds. You're probably not going to be generating a group's reports faster than 1 per second, right? So this should be more than enough to differentiate one group's reports from another. Okay, so we've created the path object. That obviously does nothing. It just says, hey, here's a path object. I want to eventually write something to that place on this file system, right? So I'm going to say with pd.excel writer, and then I'm going to say write path. Where am I going to write this to? I'm going to write it to the path, which I've created up here. And I'm going to say as writer, and I'm going to say group info. And this actually, I don't want to say group info. I actually want to say groups reports. I don't want group info. I want groups report. I don't want the group info data frame. I want the groups report that we spent a lot of time and effort on bringing in each group's corresponding members and their details. So I'm going to say groups report. I'm going to say dot to Excel. And I'm going to say writer. So using the writer, I'm going to create a file with a sheet name equal to groups. And then I'm going to say index is equal to false. This last parameter here, index is equal to false, it's basically going to avoid having a repetitive row numbering system. So I'm going to use the one that's built into Excel. I don't really care to have an additional row numbering going down a column because Excel already has one built in. You can keep it as true if you want, but for me, it's just one additional column that's not providing any value. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to Excel. Let me go ahead and open up that file that we just wrote. And let me switch over to Excel now. Okay, so here's our groups report that we just wrote to this Excel workbook. And I'm going to go ahead and expand this column width so we can see the data. This is our groups report, right? So we have one row per group, per member of that group. And as we previously mentioned, or I walked through, we have 2 users, and each of those 2 users are part of the 2 groups. So we have 4 rows. And that wraps up this video on generating groups reports. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau server. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.